Hi there, Tomas Vincente. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Thanks very much, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here. Sure. Well, in my mundane life, I am a scholar, an academic, working in the areas of ancient religions and esotericism. Somewhere in the course of my advanced studies, I became fascinated with the history of esotericism. I was actually working in a slightly different area at the time. And I, in fact, had a lifelong interest in mysterious and spooky things, we might say, just a kind of juvenile interest. Um, then, in the course of my doctoral studies, in fact, I became interested in esotericism as a field of research, and of course, these days there's a kind of booming scholarly movement in the study of esotericism. So I, have kind of two vocations as a researcher and an author. On the one hand, working within the methodologies of the academy, um, and on the other, as I suppose, an occultist. I mean, we can get into the terminology and how appropriate it is. Um, but yeah, on the other hand, as Tomas, which is a pseudonym, um, I am interested in, you might say, moving beyond the limiting methodologies of the academy, which certainly are a crucial bedrock for my esoteric work. But reaching a little beyond what those analytical methodologies can show us to an encounter with the ineffable, with mystery, with what lies beyond human conceptualization, and in developing techniques that can open the soul to those mysterious forces.
So, how does that? Obviously, the book feels like a journey of sorts, almost like, especially from your introduction, well, from David Beth's introduction and your introduction on the book. It feels like you there was some kind of initiatic process almost that happened with the book. Would you say that did the book kind of come from this lifelong sort of interest, or was it something that kind of popped up, the subject matter, I should say, that sort of popped up as you were doing some other research, or it felt to me like something that you'd been working on for quite a long time?
So the book certainly draws together a number of currents that I had been invested in for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the Egyptological dimension. Another is my fascination with the weird fiction of Lovecraft, and in particular Kenneth Grant's unusual approach to Lovecraft as a possible vehicle of occult knowledge, a kind of unwitting vehicle of occult knowledge. And a third current was my interest in the testimonials relating to European witchcraft.
Mm.
And the work is a very strange kind of synthesis of those three currents, which on the face of it probably seem to have very little to do with one another.
Mm.
Yeah, and we could certainly talk about the way the research unfolded.
Yeah, let's do that. I think it's because, like you say, it is they seem on the surface to be very disparate subjects, don't they? Whereas
They certainly do. They certainly do. And on a first description of the book, as I think some critics might have noted, it sounds a little bit like weird fiction in itself, right?
Mhm.
But as I probed ever more deeply into the connections between these currents, it became clear to me, and I think that I've made a pretty strong case for this in the book, that there are connections here that are far beyond the realms of coincidence. Let's just say, and we can get into what some of those connections are. I'm sure we will. But in terms of the genesis of the research, I became interested in the figure of Nyarlathotep in Lovecraft's weird fiction. This protean messenger figure who appears in many guises throughout Lovecraft's stories. And in particular, I was interested in his representation in Dreams in the Witch House as the Black Man of the Sabbath, a figure who appears in witchcraft testimonials of the early modern period, especially in British witchcraft testimonials, as the initiator of the witch cult. Lovecraft got a lot of his information about witchcraft from Margaret Murray's book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe. So he would have read of the Black Man of the Sabbath in her work. But he draws a connection between this figure of Nyarlathotep and the Black Man of the Sabbath. And Nyarlathotep himself is a figure who appeared to Lovecraft in a dream, a very unnerving dream, which he records in his correspondence, which really shook him and manifested in some quite unpleasant physical symptoms. He describes a kind of what we might call an ocular migraine that persisted for some time after the dreaming of Nyarlathotep, which resulted immediately in the prose poem by that name, which he says was basically written in his dream. So this is a very unusual dream. So the figure is obviously fictive, and yet it has this weird origin in Lovecraft's dreaming mind, which echoes in a strange way throughout the various appearances of Nyarlathotep in the fiction, where we see over and over again that the gnosis offered by Nyarlathotep and the effects of that gnosis are connected with vision, in particular with distortions of vision. So I realized that this theme of optical distortion was a kind of thread linking all of the appearances of Nyarlathotep. And it was also rooted in Lovecraft's own experience of this god. And I began to explore gematria, which is a technique that I often use. A kind of visionary technique for exploring synchronistic associations.
Yeah, something Grant was interested in as well, wasn't he? He was very
Yeah,
gematria heavy.
yeah, and as you will have noted in the book, discovered some very unusual coincidences
Mm.
in rendering the name of Nyarlathotep both in Greek and in Hebrew, various permutations. I came up over and over again with this connection to the eye. In the very, you might say, encrypted in the very name, Nyarlathotep. So in one formulation, his name equals 780, which is the very same numeration as Ayin, in Hebrew, the I. And in another, a completely different numeration in Greek, his name equals 1500, which is equivalent to the Greek word. Sorry, 1500 being an enumeration of the name in Hebrew, is equivalent to the Greek name ops, right? So that in itself is highly improbable, right? That we would get this, no matter which language you might say we use to transliterate this name, we arrive at this connection to the I, which again is central to the appearances of this figure in the fiction, right? This theme of optical distortion, cognitive derangement, which accompanies the sinister gnosis of this god. And then Lovecraft's own dreamed experience of the god and the attendant physical symptoms. I began to see, well, there's something going on here. Right? There's something going on. And then I began to map out some of the possible symbolic associations that might connect Nyarlathotep to witch lore, right? And Lovecraft's decision to map that figure onto the Black Man of the Sabbath, which again could be perfectly explained, you might say, in terms of the influence of Margaret Murray on his thought, right? One might say there's nothing more to it than a kind of fictive borrowing of those materials. But I realized that, a comparison of the initiatory function of Nyarlathotep in the fiction with the witchcraft testimonials, the role of the Black Man of the Sabbath as an initiator into the witch cult, and also the relationship between Azathoth, who is, as it were, the god of chaos, who Nyarlathotep follows, right? He is the herald of Azathoth, and this figure of the sabbatic goat, right? The devil as the sabbatic goat, who is the kind of central figure of the witch cult, and who is served in turn by the Black Man of the Sabbath. Is this okay? You can see that there's a kind of parallelism here.
Yeah. This is what really struck me in the book, actually. Immediately I was like, oh my God, yeah, he's right. It was
So then I began, if you explore the witchcraft testimonials, which of course have to be approached with caution, because we have to kind of peel away the biases and ideological projections of inquisitors, right? The accusers of so-called witches. We have to do so very delicately. But there is a kind of underlying folkloric bedrock there, as I think many scholars or historians of witchcraft would concede. Carlo Ginzburg is of course a famous proponent of this idea that there is some kind of shamanistic element underlying many witchcraft testimonials, and other scholars have cautiously followed that approach, right? That witchcraft was not simply a fantasy of the Inquisition. It might have been in many cases, right, where innocents were accused based on nothing at all, right? But in other cases, we're dealing with individuals who might have been engaged in ritual healing within a kind of rural community. And those practices might be traceable ultimately to very, very ancient, and I use this word with qualification, shamanistic currents. So I became interested in thinking about what initiation means in all of these contexts, right? What initiation might have meant within that so-called witch cult, um, where individuals in a certain way are imagined to completely part ways with orthodox religious belief in a very radical way, right? Pledging themselves to the devil,
Mm.
right? The antithesis of true religion, a kind of sinister inversion of religious belief. So, what is that issue in that, you might say, in that fear that there are these individuals who seem to be Christians on the surface, but are secretly in the service of the devil? Like, what kind of spiritual experience is at issue there? And once we kind of remove the ideological projections of the Christian worldview, the fearful imaginings of the Christian worldview, is there something in that experience that is worthwhile?
Mm.
What initiatory value does it have? Um, and this kind of touches on the meaning of the so-called left-hand path,
Mm.
and why so many occultists are drawn to that sort of adversarial, countercultural understanding of initiation. So we have some kind of connection between this notion of sinister gnosis in Lovecraft's fiction, right, where Nyarlathotep l- leads these hapless protagonists in Lovecraft stories to this mind-shattering gnosis of the outer ones, which of course is presented as something no one would ever want,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
I
A
was going to
kind of
say it's.
horrifying experience, which is not unlike the fearful projections of the Christian authorities who accused witches of diabolism,
Mm.
right? So you see, in both cases, we have these fearful ideological constructions which are disguising some kind of primal initiatory experience, which, from the point of view of the normative mind, um, seems like something diabolical, something evil, something simply to be feared. But maybe there's something salvific in this. Maybe there's something necessary in this sinister moment. The third current, and I realize I'm talking way too much here probably, but I'll just mention this and see what you think about it. The third current is this Egyptological current.
Hmm.
So I thought, how might we get beyond these sort of fearful representations of sinister gnosis, whether it's Lovecraft's kind of materialist uh, kind of aversion to he's both fascinated with and repelled by, and he's a very complicated figure psychologically speaking, right?
Oh yeah.
He's absolutely captivated by this idea of a sinister alien gnosis and horrified by it. And then on the other hand, dealing with the testimonials relating to witchcraft, right? We have to get beyond these kind of Christian ideological biases that are distorting the reality of these shamanistic experiences. So how do we kind of rescue? How do we get to the initiatory core here? So I turn to the Egyptological material. Now, why? Because, well, for one thing, oddly, Nyarlathotep is described as a kind of antique pharaoh, right? And the name itself is a kind of Egyptianizing
Yeah. The
name.
OTEP at the
Yeah,
end.
it's a weird touch. And again, you could dismiss it as nothing but a kind of literary fancy, except it became clear to me that in the description of Nyarlathotep as the faceless god, there is a weird resonance with Osiris, who, of course, is always represented as a pharaoh, who is described in Egyptian sources as the Black One.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Nyarlathotep is consistently described as the Black Man of the Sabbath, for example. And also the facelessness of Nyarlathotep, which maps onto the headlessness of Osiris. So Osiris is described in Egyptian sources as the headless one, both in Egyptian sources and later in the Greek translation. He's called Akephalos, the headless god, which is, in the most basic sense, an allusion to his dismemberment by Set. He's the god of mummification. He dies, he's dismembered, and he is revivified, the kind of prototypical mummy. Headlessness for the Egyptians is a way of alluding to the decomposition of the body, the disintegration of the mundane person at death. And of course, there is a hope there within the Egyptian religious framework that the individual can pass through this experience of decomposition and disintegration to be reborn as Osiris was, to attain a new head, to attain a new face. And facelessness and headlessness are synonymous within the Egyptian mythological symbolism. So now we have something strange, another kind of uncanny coincidence, right? We not only have the pharaonic image of Nyarlathotep and his representation as the Black Man of the Sabbath, but now we have this deeper connection between facelessness and the headless god, Osiris. And the Greek word, the Greek word akephalos has the same gematria as Azathoth, as I discovered just in playing around with the names. So yeah, various pieces began to fall into place. And I realized that there was more than a passing resemblance between the initiatory profile of Osiris and that of Nyarlathotep. And an interesting connection, especially between Osiris, who is equated with the nocturnal sun in Egyptian New Kingdom texts, the dead sun who awaits reanimation under the earth, and Azathoth, who is described by Lovecraft as this nuclear chaos at the center of infinity. Both of these principles, who of course are presented in mythological, symbolic guise, are getting at this unfathomable origin of reality, this ineffable source, which the Egyptians speak of as the nocturnal sun. Lovecraft has a different way of describing it, but it's getting at the same point, that there is this primal singularity which is hidden within the depths of space, as it were, in the Egyptian case, in the depths of the underworld, which is the source of all of manifest reality. And every morning the sun god is reborn. Ra is reborn from the corpse of Osiris, and the world begins anew. This initiatory experience, in a certain way, maps onto that very, very ancient Egyptian symbology. So I began to trace the connections between Azathoth and Osiris, with this notion of the black sun, and discovered the central importance of the symbol of the ram of Mendes, who is, you might say, an animal manifestation of Osiris, described as the soul of Osiris. While Osiris dreams in the underworld awaiting resurrection, and when he encounters the sun god during his nightly journey through the underworld, the two are synthesized, and they take the form of this mummiform ram-headed figure, who is described as the Ram of Mendes. The Ram of Mendes was worshipped in Mendes, the precinct of Mendes in Egypt, as a kind of fertility god and a manifestation of the fertilizing power of Osiris. And the Greeks describe the Ram of Mendes as a goat, the goat of Mendes. And of course, eventually, that symbolism of the goat of Mendes is woven into witch lore. So again, we have another connection here between the Egyptological symbolism and the symbolism of witchcraft in this figure of the goat of Mendes, who, of course, Eliphaz Levi ties to witchcraft famously.
Yeah.
But that goat, the devil as the goat, appears quite commonly in the later European witchcraft testimonials. So that was another thread linking Osiris as the god of the underworld to the devil figure of witch lore. So you can see how the project kind of built up from an intuition
Yeah.
into something quite quite intricate and very difficult to elaborate. But I hope that at least gets us started.
Yeah, definitely. The thing that really struck me early in the book, you talk about this kind of weird fear that, you know, in the modern age, we're meant to be in this kind of post-Christian kind of age, yet when these kinds of topics are brought up, these so-called, you know, post-Christians all of a sudden become very fearful of the idea of things like blood pacts or you know, goat-like figures appearing. It's almost as if actually they are still they hold in these kind of Christian kind of fears. And the other thing that kind of interested me was that Lovecraft himself was a deeply fearful person, wasn't he? And Nyarlathotep seems to have come from this this place of fear. I found he wrote a letter to his friend, who was it, Kleiner, Reinhard Kleiner,
Yes.
and it said, "Don't fail to see." This is he apparently in the dream where he you know, first sort of discovered Nyarlathotep. He receives a letter from a friend of his called Samuel Loveman, and it says, like, "Don't fail to see Nyarlathotep if he comes to Providence. He's horrible beyond anything you can imagine, but wonderful. He haunts one for hours afterwards. I'm still shuddering at what he showed." It's a brilliant bit of
That's brilliant. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and it's perfectly kind of sums up that kind of fear, doesn't it? That kind of this idea. And Lovecraft himself was, I mean, he feared everything from, you know, society, it seemed, and other races as well. He was, you know,
Yes.
deeply troubled by other races. It's
Yes.
almost comic effect. I mean, it's the kind of, you know, I've never seen writing quite so. You know, I can't think of even the word for it. It's almost comically racist,
Yeah.
if you know what I
Yeah.
mean. It's like almost like a parody, but
Yes.
but yeah,
Yeah.
this. What is your take on this? This idea of, because one thing the book seems to really delve into is this idea that actually initiation, part of it's about fear. It's about that kind of confrontation with a sort of a void, a darkness, and the, you know, the true initiate or the true aspirant actually embraces that kind of fear and that kind of you know, uses it as a positive almost.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly the initiatory experience of the characters in Lovecraft stories is a very unsettling one.
Hmm.
Um, you know, a complete inversion of our ordinary cognitive and perceptual grasp of reality. Something similar is hinted at in the witchcraft testimonials. There's a kind of when the individual signs their name, as it were, in the devil's book. And this is an image that also appears in Lovecraft's story, Dreams in the Witch House. They are rejecting the status quo entirely, right? They are leaving behind the world of normative values. What does that mean from an initiatory point of view? How can that be relevant to us as modern practitioners? Well, if we think about initiation, right? All of the occult and esoteric orders talk about initiation, but we don't often think about what it actually means in a very basic sense. And what are we after in pursuing initiation? What is this hidden knowledge that we're after, and what do we think it's going to do for us? There is a kind of profound dissatisfaction with the limiting conceptualizations of the modern rational mind. We are entirely inframed in this rationalistic, kind of technocratic worldview that seems to leave no room for imagination, seems to leave no room for mystery, claims that it has, at least in principle, the answer to the riddle of existence, which it can present to us in an entirely analytical way. Now, of course, there's much that's tremendously impressive about that modern scientific worldview. But this notion that we have somehow dispensed with the superstitions of the past, right? That we no longer need to engage in, you might say, the realms of spiritual imagination, spiritual imagining and intuition. That we're now kind of in a post-religious even frame. I think that is a bit of a delusion, frankly. We are always pulled to mystery, right? And it's interesting to think historically about, the rise of supernatural fiction and weird fiction after the Industrial Revolution. Why is it that we see this explosion of interest in ghost stories, weird fiction, and an interest that continues on to this day, right? But always in a fictive form, always as something that we claim not to take seriously. But at the same time, it lingers, right? So the realms of mystery, which you might say were banished from the scientific paradigm, now take root in the world of fiction and pure imagination. And we think we can explore them safely at a distance. And we even suppose that none of it is to be taken very seriously, right? So we can laugh at old superstitions and magical beliefs and speak of them as primitive or outmoded. But none of those derisive attitudes, it seems to me, can satisfactorily explain the persistence of these beliefs. Carl Jung once wrote about this and noted that modern ridicule of ancient superstition actually masks a profound fear, right? And the individual may be entirely oblivious to this in their own personality and their own personal attitudes to these subjects. But in a wider cultural perspective, I think this is important, that the repression of these older esoteric spiritual currents within the rationalistic worldview actually feeds them in a curious way, right? They gain power through repression.
Yeah.
We sublimate them in the form of literature, as Lovecraft himself did, right? Sublimating his own fearful dream experiences, which he could not handle as a rationalistic human, transferring them into mere fiction where he could sort of deal with them, as it were.
Almost control them.
Control them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we can see this happening quite clearly on a wider cultural scale. Lovecraft is just an extreme example of this, right? With, as you say, his extreme moralizing and racist attitudes. He's a kind of hyperbolic example. But yeah, these the soul hungers for contact with the ineffable. It longs to be freed from the enframing control of abstract ideological conceptualization. And so we are drawn to these experiences one way or the other, right? We might be drawn simply to, in the most kind of superficial way, you might say, to fiction, to fictive representations of these experiences, which both can excite and repel the person, right? Or we can be drawn in a more substantial way to seek out initiation and to authentically question the predominant rationalizing biases of our culture.
Yeah, it's definitely one thing. I mean, I sort of briefly mentioned this in our email conversation, which was I was a member of the OTO for a decade or so, for a long time, and when Kenneth Grant's name was brought up, and this is obviously I left, quite a few years ago now, and but whenever his name was brought up, the big critique of him, or he was almost seen as like almost a comical character in a weird way to the older Thelemites within the OTO. But the thing that was always brought up was this idea that he had sort of dared to kind of incorporate Lovecraft's work into a kind of thelemic framework. Obviously, and that's why he was eventually removed from the leadership in the UK OTO. That's one of the main reasons, anyway.
Right.
But it feels like even within the culture, as it were, there's a kind of a fear of, in some ways, of approaching topics that aren't pre-controlled by, say, an Aleister Crowley or a Golden Dawn, or this idea that you can somehow bring in fictitious, I'm saying this in quotes, like fictitious kind of ideologies into and kind of renew occult beliefs. Somehow it feels like there's a similar fear there, isn't there? And Grant for a long time was kind of prosecuted almost, because of that. It felt like, he was kind of until very recently seen as, like I said, almost a comical kind of character that had kind of warped Crowley's ideologies.
Yeah. There's so many directions we could go with this.
Yeah.
Well, modern occultists like to think of themselves as the custodians of the authentic esoteric traditions that have been kind of displaced within the modern scientific worldview, right? So if you want access to that primal gnosis, you need to be initiated into one of these organizations. On the other hand, we might argue, and I think Grant certainly had this intuition, that if you really want to identify those individuals who are tuned in to these repressed, to these currents which have been repressed within the modern scientific worldview, look to the artists, right? Look to those highly sensitive, intuitive individuals. You might say have a kind of inborn capacity to open themselves to these hyper rational influences.
Mm.
Right. So occultists like to think that they have some kind of monopoly over mystery. But in a kind of, maybe in an ironic way, when you look at many of these occult systems, which have evolved from the 19th century onwards, they are all conceptual constructs of one kind or another, which over time become ossified. They become no different than any other religious worldview.
Mm-hmm.
You have to accept that this is the model of reality, the tree of life, or whatever it is. Follow the directions that are given to you. Don't ask too many questions. Stay in line. And then at the end of the journey, you will be rewarded in some way. um, there's, it's the kind of literalism and fundamentalism that emerges there is startling, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
And this notion that surely fiction cannot be a legitimate source of esoteric knowledge. I mean, where does that even come from? When we think about the fact that, if we trace back these magical traditions to the pre-modern world and even beyond, it was always the faculty of imagination that was seen as the seat of magical experience. The properly trained and attuned fantasy of the human. That is where we can communicate with these numinous powers. The notion that fiction has nothing to do with occultism is just bizarre when you think about the preeminent role of symbols.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the tarot. Is the high priestess of the tarot more objectively real than Lovecraft's Nyarlathotep? I mean, they're both fictive, but they at the same time encode some kind of primal experience, some kind of primal symbolism. So, yeah, so I'm with you entirely that there's a kind of false divide there between, you might say, fiction and non-fiction, which are, in that binary really is a binary that belongs to the modern worldview, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when we think about fact, we're talking about what the scientific methodologies provide us with, right? And anything that does not conform to those methodologies is fiction, right? And that includes all of these ancient esoteric systems, which are now jettisoned to the dustbin of history. Well, it's in fiction, in weird fiction, that those currents continue to thrive, you might say,
Mm-hmm.
in the modern world. It's in the work of visionary artists, and Grant was very interested in surrealism. He talks of, and of course the work of Austin, the work of Spare.
Mm-hmm.
Grant realized that artists inadvertently tune into these mysterious forces. They do so quite naturally. And so he developed really an experimental approach to occultism, which is not appreciated by traditionalists who think that initiation is simply about parroting kind of pre-established models of reality. Um, it, the critics of there are things, of course, that we can criticize in the methodologies of Grant.
Hmm.
I'm not simply a Grantian, though Grant has been one influence. There are some limitations of his approach, I think, but the complaint that Grant blurs reality and fantasy is not a legitimate one.
No.
This is his
No.
actual intended and explicitly stated aim, right? For example, in Outer Gateways, one of his Typhonian books, he very clearly explains, right? He talks about surrealism. He talks about the work of visionary artists. And he relates his own esoteric methodologies to the development of a kind of paranoid mentality, a kind of delirium, a kind of self-induced delirium that allows the initiate to break through the limiting, ossifying influence of rationality, right? To open themselves up, as it were, through delirium and even through a kind of delusion, a kind of engaging in a kind of fantasy that can be freeing and liberating.
I mean, if you think about ritual, especially these kind of more structured thelemic or Golden Dawn rituals, it's that kind of thing, isn't it? You're taking part in a play of sorts. It's so I've never understood that kind of mockery of Grant in that sense. That this idea that our version of the occult is somehow verified or something. It's like because Crowley was involved with it, it's the correct occult. If that makes sense. Or and it's well, Crowley was obviously influenced in his time by the Golden Dawn and so on and so on and so on. I often wonder if what Crowley would think of this kind of rigid kind of adherence to
Right.
it seems very strange to me that there hasn't been like more modern editions. Other writers are often it feels like there are other great occult writers out there that could be added into these thelemic systems, but that seems sacrilege to Thelemites almost. It's
well, when you set yourself up as a prophet, you can kind of expect that.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the unfortunate consequences, right? You have followers.
Yeah, true.
Right? Who will look upon you as a kind of a prophet. Assuming the role of the prophet is a tricky thing, right? Because it can foreclose, it can seem to foreclose future discovery. It can seem to foreclose an open experimental approach. But of course, in other respects, Crowley was extremely experimental in his occultism. Right? So there's a kind of tension there within Crowley's own approach, because of course he was a very revolutionary, countercultural figure who was all about opening up new vistas, new even scientific approaches, as he called them.
Yeah.
The method is science, he says.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, in becoming a prophet, you set your system up as another religion.
Which he warned about as well, didn't he? I mean,
Yeah, so it's very
yeah.
complicated. One way to look at Grant's approach and his works is that they are performative rather than descriptive. So what I mean by that is he's not simply giving you a system. It's not like reading the rituals of the Golden Dawn or even reading some of the prescribed thelemic rituals. The writing of Grant does something. It's not simply describing, it is intending to create an effect on the reader. It's actually, by piling on the endless gematria and using extremely obscure writing, not dissimilar in a way from Lovecraft's own unusual writing. Lovecraft, Grant can kind of pull you into a hallucinatory frame of mind.
Yeah, that's what I love about him.
Yeah. That's the real goal here. It's not that we should take everything Grant says literally, as though he's presenting us with a fully articulated system. So I think the critics of Grant have definitely missed the point on that score.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing he also gets criticized for quite a lot that I think is ridiculous as well is he sort of brings this idea forth that Lovecraft's characters or his kind of writings are kind of received almost dreams, rather than just being the subconscious kind of arranging itself. He makes the implication that that somehow the dreams themselves are a form of occult wisdom, and that Lovecraft is kind of filtering that out through the method of fiction, essentially. And that's another thing that Grant gets a lot of criticism for saying, because I know that one of the big kind of contests against that is that obviously Lovecraft himself said he doesn't consider himself an occultist or blah blah blah, but then I guess the counter to that would be, well, a lot of artists don't think that they're occultists, but they are. It's
and Grant never says that Lovecraft was an occultist.
No.
What he says is that Lovecraft was tuning into some of the same currents that Crowley tuned into. Now, where it goes wrong, I think, sometimes in Grant's exposition, but again, we have to remember it's not clear where fact and fiction diverge for Grant, right? We always have to remember that. But there are sometimes indications that he thinks that there's a one-to-one correspondence between various images and figures in Lovecraft and concepts that we find in Crowley. Where it almost seems like he's trying to excavate a complete occult system that's buried within Lovecraft's fiction. That's, I think, where we can be a little critical of Grant's approach. Absolutely, we have to remember that Lovecraft was not an occultist, thought occultism, at least in his waking attitudes, thought occultism was silly nonsense. In a certain way, his lack of knowledge of occult systems is actually a plus, right? Because he's not inframed by, a fully worked out understanding of occult initiation or the history of occultism. The images in his fiction are not restricted. There's a kind of openness. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah.
If a writer of weird fiction was completely inframed by occult knowledge, it would come across as stilted and artificial.
Yeah, it's sort of unfiltered, isn't it? It's like a
Yeah.
pure kind of translation of that kind of occult wisdom or whatever you want to call it.
But it's insinuations, it's echoes of a primal symbolism rather than some kind of fully articulated system. And in my own work, that's the way I've approached it, that there are weird echoes of very ancient Egyptian symbolism, right, in the connection between Nyarlathotep, the faceless god, and the headless Osiris, between the figure of Anubis, who we haven't touched on yet, the herald of Osiris, and the figure of Nyarlathotep as a kind of herald or initiator or liminal figure who is both human and beast simultaneously, who is sort of gesturing towards an initiatory experience that will reunite the human soul with the chthonic powers, right? The hidden powers of the cosmos. So yeah, there are these threads within the fiction that we can kind of pull. And it's quite a remarkable thing that Lovecraft in his dreaming mind was able to tune into some of these very archaic spiritual initiatory experiences.
And it's the way he transmitted them as well. There's something about the way Lovecraft writes that's very different to other writers, and that's another thing that I think originally that's kind of what appealed to me about Grant strangely as well, was this, like, he kind of, I got the impression that he had that same feeling about Lovecraft, that there's something about the way he writes, so I can't put my finger on it.
Yes.
It's there's almost like a dream logic in the way he writes. It reminds me a little bit weirdly of David Lynch and the way he presents his films. There's this kind of, you feel like you're stepping into somebody's dream almost when you read Lovecraft. And again, to me, that kind of, I don't know what it is, that I find that incredibly appealing as someone that's very been interested in the occult for a very long time, because it feels unlike other horror, I suppose, or other styles of writing. And I don't know, I don't know if you have something.
Now, where one has to be cautious, I think, and this maybe gets to where I might part ways with Grant, is that being absorbed in this kind of hallucinatory worldview, not worldview, sorry, a kind of hallucinatory experience. That's intoxicating, and it can be in many ways liberating, and it certainly can open us up to mystery. But then the question is, what do we do with it in a practical sense? When we come back to mundane reality, as it were, when we close Grant's book, what are we going to do with that? In terms of constructing for ourselves a kind of initiatory set of initiatory practices that can kind of further cultivate those numinous intuitions and experiences that Grant has kind of opened up for us. And Grant doesn't give us any help there.
No.
You're not going to find any kind of workable system, in my view. And so the limitation of Grant is that he kind of jumps straight away, headfirst, into this kind of hallucinatory world without first setting out a bedrock of objective knowledge. And that's one of the ways in which my own method differs from Grant, partly, of course, because I'm a scholar myself. But there is great value in anchoring your spiritual framework in a bedrock of objective analysis, so that you don't simply get lost in that hallucinatory world. And when you do that, I discovered this in my own work. The impact of what is revealed in those more visionary moments, and through the use of those more obscure occult technologies like gematria, the impact of the revelations is so much more powerful when you begin from a standpoint of reasoned fact, right? So if I can ground my more visionary experiences in a knowledge of Egyptology, in an understanding of the deep roots of witch lore and possible connections to shamanic experiences, now I can test myself. Now I can check myself and make sure that I'm not simply engaging in fantasy, right? In magic, the imagination has to be trained to a certain extent. We can't simply let ourselves go off into hallucination, right? We also have to be able to come back to reality. and relate those experiences to the here and the now. So combining rational methodologies with occult methodologies has been very important in my own approach. Because initiation requires us to come back to reality at a certain point, to find a way to relate what we've discovered to the here and the now.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that a lot later in the book, where you sort of go over the ordeal of the abyss and the clip off and the this kind of thing, where you kind of, there's this kind of destruction of the self, and but eventually, you know, if you're grounded enough and you do it correctly, you reappear in the mundane, as it were, but change.
Yes.
Kind of thing. It's that kind of thing, isn't it? Whereas I do see what you mean with Grant, though. He does, that is it's the lack of any kind of, he doesn't also, it's not really a grimoire almost, is it, what he writes? It's more of a, it seems very accountative, doesn't it? It's he's more, yeah, he's not really presenting you with a system or with a you know, any workings, as it were. Well, there's some, but not, you know, very, very scant amounts.
Right.
Yeah,
That's right.
It is, yeah, it often felt like there was a book missing from Grant, that was kind of like you say, like an anchor almost, that you could go back to, you know, where you reappear from his abyss, as it were.
Yes, yeah, he's not going to give us that bedrock, so we need to supply it for ourselves.
Yeah.
That's right. His work is, as I said, kind of magically performative. It's meant to do something to us.
Yeah.
It's meant to stir us. It's meant to open us up, to make us functional antennae, as it were, for these alien transmissions. But then what we do with it is the next question. Yeah.
Talking of Cliff Off is something that we've not really mentioned on the show. There's a whole other show, a whole other conversation probably we could have. Like, you could easily have an entire show on just that one subject. But you talk about the 26th path and the Cliff Off a lot in the book. I was wondering, could you talk us through kind of what that is for people that, you know, haven't read like Liber 231, or, you know, this, you know, for the listener who's not well steeped in that, would you be able to talk us through the importance of that within the framework of this book?
Sure, let me try.
I know that's a bit of a tough one.
So if it wasn't tricky enough, we now have a fourth sort of current that's woven into the book, which is a Kabbalistic framework. And, you know, I use that Kabbalistic framework with some caution, because, of course, it is a transcendental framework. And the initiatory approach that I'm following in the book, and which I think is glimpsed in you know, the witchcraft testimonials, and also in the ancient Osirian cultus, is not a transcendental experience. It's not about ascending to the ideal transcendental realm. It's about communing with the chthonic forces that are all around us and beneath us. It's about coming back into communion with the invisible forces of this world. And that is how I understand the left-hand path, and that's a terminology that means different things to different people.
Oh yes, that's one that can we bring that up.
For me, it is adversarial in the sense that it involves a critique of transcendentalism with all of its conceptual abstractions and all of its dualisms and binary oppositions. That is precisely what we have to break through. That's what Grant is doing in his work too. He's trying to break through that conceptual armor, right? To get at this more original encounter with the daimonic or enthusing forces of the cosmos. So I use the Kabbalistic framework with some reservation, because it is one of these transcendental maps that shows you how to get from this world to the the supernal realms. But still, it has lots of Kabbalah gives us lots of tools, methodologies, and symbologies that can be helpful, especially if one is coming from that kind of tradition, right? A kind of that sort of Christian Kabbalistic tradition that informs the Golden Dawn and even to some extent Crowley's system.
Mm-hmm.
So to get to the point, on this map of the Tree of Life, which shows us how the modalities of divine essence are connected to one another and how they ultimately emanate to form our world. There are various paths, right? Various pathways, emanative channels that connect these modalities. And one of those pathways is called the path of Ayin, which means I in Hebrew. The 26 paths. The paths correspond to the Hebrew letters as well. Now that path on the Tree of Life connects the sphere of Hod, or Mercury, to Tipperet, which is that centralmost Sephira on the Tree of Life. And when one crosses that path in Kabbalah, one is passing from the realm of formation, or Yetzirah, to the realm of Bria, or creation. So we're passing from the lower Sephira on the Tree of Life, the lower triad, to the middle. So this is a kind of fundamental initiatory moment, as it were. We're breaking, you might say, we're breaking through the ordinary phenomenal consciousness to a deeper initiatic understanding of reality. Now that path, as Crowley explains it, corresponds to the devil card in tarot. So it's linked to the goat of Mendes, and Capricorn. So the devil Atu is ruled by Capricorn, the goat fish. So we have a bunch of astrological associations here as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in witch lore, the devil appears in the form of the goat at the witch's Sabbath. And the goat has this much more ancient connection to Osiris, originally the ram of Mendes. Right? It comes to be known as the goat of Mendes. So the goat and the ram are symbolisms that are gesturing to the primal fertilizing power of the black sun, as the Egyptians would call it. And this path of Ayin is somehow connected to that symbolism. Are you with me so far?
Yep.
Yeah. So the devil as the initiator is the primary force that is in play as we move from the sphere of Mercury, or Hod, to this deeper experience of Tipperet, which Crowley links to coming into contact with our own inner daimon, or guardian angel, right? So we are moving within ourselves to a deeper understanding of the self beyond the phenomenal. And the initiator on that path is the devil, right? Which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So this signals already that this initiatory experience is going to be quite traumatic, potentially, right? It's going to involve a complete overturning of our ordinary experience of reality. And on the devil Atu, very prominently in the Thoth deck, you have the eye, right? The eye, that single eye in the forehead of the goat. Ayin in Hebrew means eye, right?
Yep, and this is bringing us all back to the the Nyarlathotep stuff again.
Nyarlathotep, right,
Yeah.
and this theme of optical distortion, right?
Mhm.
Gnosis involves a transformation of vision, right? This is what all of this symbolism is pointing to, and that's what's happening on this path of Ayin. Our seeing, our ways of seeing, our perceptual and cognitive relationship to reality and to ourselves is being radically upset. The devil, we have to, in a certain way, dedicate ourselves to the devil at
Mhm.
this point and completely step outside of our ordinary experience of reality. Um, Now, the devil, the goat, in Greek mythological terms, is Pan. And in fact, the goat of Mendes was linked to the god Pan in ancient times, right? So the Egyptian symbolism of the Osirian ram or goat is going to be linked to the god Pan in Greek
Mhm.
mythology. And Pan literally means all, the all. So the goat is a symbol of the primordial all or totality, either in its unmanifest form as the black sun, Osiris, or Azathoth, as Lovecraft would call him, that primal singularity from which all of reality emanates. Or we can think of Pan as the all in the sense of the totality of the created ordered universe, which emanates from that source. So Pan as the pangenitor, the creator of this organized cosmos. And cosmologically, what is explored on the Tree of Life is precisely that relationship between the unmanifest and the manifest, right? That from this primal, ineffable source, the boundless principle in Kabbalah, the Ein Sof, all of these modalities of divine essence emanate and emerge, interweaving, coursing through this hierarchy until we reach Malkut at the bottom, our world of time and space and matter. So cosmologically, this journey through the pathways is all about relating Pan in these two senses. Pan as the unmanifest totality, and Pan as the complete ordered world of Malkuth. The initiate, as they travel in visionary trance, right, through these pathways, is in a way emulating that dialectic, right? We're moving from the ordered, complex understanding of the self as an embodied person inhabiting the realm of Malkut with a kind of limited perceptual and cognitive structure to this more unmanifest understanding of the self, which connects to Tipperet, or what Crowley calls the guardian angel. Right? So we are kind of imitating the reversion of the divine principle to its own unmanifest beginning. So Pan, the mythology of Pan, when you unpack it esoterically, is all about that relationship between the manifest and the unmanifest. And Crowley has a very interesting analysis of the word Pan, a kind of Kabbalistic unpacking of the word, where he explains it as a kind of magical formula through which we return to the womb of the mother, Nox, right? The primal beginning. So as he analyzes Pan, it begins with the the letter Pe in Hebrew,
Mhm.
which literally means mouth, and he identifies it with duality, which is to say, this is the emergence of manifestation from the unmanifest, the one becoming two. Right, so this is the process where the divine unfolds itself. Um, and then the second letter he connects to Aleph, which is the fool of tarot. So this is, you might say, the reckless cascading of the divine, right? As the fool launches himself off the cliff, right? The principle unfolding itself in this kind of free play, this careless, creative activity. And then finally, we have the N, right? The third letter, which he identifies with death, the Atu, the terror of death, and the watery abyss of Scorpio. This is the moment of reversion, right? So we begin with emanation, duality emerging from singularity, right? From the Azoth, or from the black sun, as the Egyptians would call it. Then we have the emanative energies, the fool, which emanates from that origin point. And then we have a turning back as the divine reverts to its unmanifest unity. And this is the N, the Nun, the final letter. So the word pan, and this is really an ingenious analysis to my mind, right? Because it's linking up both senses of the all, right? The all as the unmanifest and the all as manifest reality. And he's saying that in that symbolism of the goat, the devil as the goat, the devil Atu, we have a pictorial representation of this formula, which is all about descent and return to the source. And that's what's happening in an initiatory sense. Now, again, I would not interpret that experience in a transcendental way, right? So that's the point at which I would say that the map is a limiting one. But I would agree that the function of initiation is precisely the undoing of the manifest self.
Yeah.
And the return, our return to our own inner daimonic center, which we will discover is actually completely entangled with all of the other daimonic forces of the cosmos, right? So this is the notion that David Beth describes as the pandaimonia. The notion that what the initiatory experience actually unveils is not some kind of transcendental reality beyond this world, but the reality that everything is fundamentally entwined. Once we step outside of the kind of abstract conceptualizations of the rational mind, which wants to define and separate things, wants to dissect and analyze things, what we actually discover is that we are completely enmeshed with these unseen energies. And in this initiatory experience of kind of undoing the conceptual armor that enframes us, we are once again opened up to that daimonic experience, which is both the true experience of the self and of the cosmos simultaneously. How was that?
That was great. We're definitely going to have to do a part 2 of this, I think, at some point, because I don't want to keep you for too much longer. The book, we haven't actually mentioned the name of the book, which probably should do. It's the Faceless God. It came out a while ago, and I genuinely believe it's one of the great underrated occult books of recent years. And if people can track it down,
well, a new edition is emerging. So
yes, this is the other thing I was going to say. So perhaps what we should do is, because I have so much more I'd like to cover with you, when this second edition emerges, perhaps we should have you back on and delve deeper, if possible. But yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on, and like I said, it's genuinely one of my favorite occult reads of recent years. The Faceless God. So I look forward with great enthusiasm to a new version.
Well, I appreciate that. It's always heartening to learn that that very strange book has been meaningful to others. So,
oh yeah, no,
so
it's a fantastic. Everyone I've come in contact with that has read that book, including Dara Mason, who we had on the show recently, it's incredibly high praise all around. So it's great to hear that there's a new edition. Will there be new material within the book? Or
yes, so I've revised the original manuscript and added a new introduction, which is really a new chapter.
oh,
And David Beth is contributing a fantastic essay as
good.
well. So yeah, it's been revised and somewhat enlarged as well. So stay tuned to Theon for announcements about that. I imagine the pre-orders will be happening in the new year.
Brilliant. Oh, that's great. David's someone that we're planning to have on as well soon. It's always like trying to, I'm often criticized for not having people on soon enough on this show, but David's definitely very, very high on the list of people I want on as well. I think he's also great. Actually,
that'd be wonderful. Yeah,
Theon in general are putting out some great stuff. I mean, you're our second Theon author we've had on. We had Richard Gavin on as well recently, and he was fantastic as well. And
excellent.
Yeah. So it's definitely one of the better, I think, one of the more interesting publishers out there. And so it's always great to have an author from that fold on the show.
Great. Well, yeah, I would love to speak with you again. So
brilliant. Yeah, well, we'll definitely do that. And I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation. It was fun.